Hello, I'm Ari Adipurawidjana of Universitas Pajajaran. I'm very delighted to be here, and I would like to extend my sincerest gratitude to the organizers of ICONIC for their having invited me to speak in this conference. It is a great honor and pleasure for me to have been invited to be given this opportunity to share my varied thoughts and fragmented experiences in the intersection between art, activism, and academia. On this occasion, I would like to present my observations and views based on my own experiences, crossing over what seems to be different spheres of action, namely art, activism, and academia. While often in my oscillations from one to the other and back, I encounter familiar faces, seeing activists and academics as spectators in art and cultural events, artists invited to display works and perform in academic forums as a kind of comic relief at times, as well as showing support for the other's efforts as a kind of favor, a collegial favor. In very few instances do I actually see an actual collaboration. One is often inserted as a supplement for the other's efforts rather than, let's say, each complementing each other. Perhaps my field of vision and experiences are actually limited, but that limitation is exactly my point. What keeps me from having a more in-depth and extensive participation in other fields? So as a person who makes his living, so to speak, in the academic world, I must also admit that I constantly have prejudices about activists and professional artists. And I assume also that activists and artists also have reservations and prejudices about academics, some of which I most probably agree with. But the fact that those prejudices and those presumptions exist among us shows how there is a barrier that keeps us from knowing each other better and hindering an actual balanced collaboration between the actors of those three spheres of action. So I would like to speak about art as intervention and at the same time share the issue of the need to cross over and back between the three spheres of action, which of course entails a rethinking of what artistic, activist, and academic endeavors are and what they can mean. I will specifically take the examples of projects in which I was directly involved. Because basically, honestly, my expertise is not in either art or activism, but rather in literary studies as an academic. And therefore, most of my examples will be very myopic. It will only mostly pertain to theater and literacy, as that is the field that I'm most familiar with. I'm going to divide my talk into three parts. First, I would like to talk about the idea of art as intervention, as opposed to, let's say, art as a means by which norms are preserved. And second, I'd like to talk about art as, or in activism, as well as art as activism. That is, art as not merely an intervention that disrupts and questions prevailing norms and order, but also prompt action to bring about social change. And finally, I would like to propose that the notion of the merging of art and activism into the classroom and research, and not merely research about art and activism, but research as activism and bringing that into the classroom as a part of the curriculum, taking advantage of the institutional nature of academia to foster the sustainability of both art in activism, as well as art as activism and as activism in itself, which often, as I will talk about later, involves a kind of artfulness. Art, I think, clearly is not by nature an intervention. We can see art in various ways, and historically speaking, art has served various functions. It has historically been used by the establishment and authority to preserve the status quo, to preserve the ones in power, the prevailing norms and order. For example, in his seminal Theater of the Oppressed, a very prominent theater practitioner, and as well as alternative literacy advocate and activist Augusto Boal, offers a critique of the classical idea about art as proposed by Aristotle in his Poetics. Boal argues that Aristotle's conception of tragedy in particular, while implying also the general idea of the Aristotelian notion of the well-made play, and for the purposes of this presentation also high art in general, that Aristotle's ideas is coercive in nature, as it serves as an instrument for the ruling power to enforce control over the imagination of the public or the people who are subject to that ruling power. The Aristotelian ideals that Boal critiques are also apparent in the writings of such 18th century neoclassicists as Alexander Pope, for example. I apologize for using literature as an example, as well as 19th century literary figures as Matthew Arnold, who upholds those kinds of thinkers uphold the idea that art should represent, quote unquote, the best that has been thought and said in the civilized world. However, we also know of art, historically speaking, which critiques social conditions, art which satirizes. We are acquainted with art which, instead of representing established accepted norms, it represents views that opposes normativity or the prevailing norms and values of a particular society at a particular time. Yet there are similarities in the two opposing roles of art and the artist, both art which represents normativity as well as art that critiques normativity, in that they both assume the privilege and the place of the artist in society. For the present time, this is problematic in Indonesia as anywhere else. Alina Campana observes that, and I quote, artists embrace or struggle against the notion that they are isolated and alienated from society, which conceives artists as being solitary ascetics, dissociated from the realities of social life, unaffected by the political struggles and contestations that exist in society. Not only Campana, but also an art critic that Campana cites and refers to on this issue, Susie Gablick, notes that indeed, quote, and I quote, individualism and freedom were the great modernist buzzwords, but they are hardly the most creative response to our planet's immediate needs, he says, which, according to Gablick, demands complex and sensitive forms of interaction and linking. And Gablik further says that such relationships require a consciousness that is different from the structural isolation and self-referentiality of individualism. This is especially urgent in our current time, almost 2 decades after Gablik proposes her concept of connective aesthetics in 1997 or in 1992. In a world in which one action, one social phenomenon in one part of the world affects inevitably other social phenomenons and other social conditions in other parts of the world, how do we maintain a sense of selfhood? Does the idea of the self change, and therefore does the idea of the self of the artist change, or the activist change, or the academic change in a world that's very much intricately connected? Perhaps we might be able to look back to the idea proposed by Hannah Arendt when, in her seminal *The Human Condition*, she talks about the shift from work to action, from mere production of artifice to producing social relations, which forms the basis of human interaction and ultimately society. And in this spirit, I think Boal provides the model for art as action, as he also proposes to dismantle the separation between actor and spectator in theater, and for the purposes of my talk today, the separation between artist and the public. I myself began to think of this urgency in my explorations of how gendered, raced, and classed bodies figure in postcolonial discourse as my field of interest in literary studies and cultural studies in my daily activities carrying out literary scholarship. And while doing this, I asked the question of whether it is sufficient to talk about bodies, and whether there are other means of exploring how gendered, raced, and classed bodies find their way and place in social life. And I think this is the concerns which becomes the focus of Campana's article, and that is where she proposes a new definition of the artist's role. Similarly, she also offers a broader conception of the activist as not limited to individuals protesting in the streets, for example. Campana also warns that the conventional idea of activists and academics as educators often shows in practice where the activist and academic become agents of, and I quote, indoctrination of the masses being led by the few, and the few referring to, of course, activists and academics as elite members of society. And that becomes a risk for democracy when only the activists and the academic come together. The kind of activism initiated by individuals or groups who simultaneously play the roles of artist, activist, as well as academic or educator, have the potential of fostering democratic, social, and political life by opening alternative avenues where, and I quote Campana again, insurgent citizens who challenge those with political and cultural power, as well as honor the critical tradition within the dominant culture that makes such critique possible and intelligible. And I think that is what our society needs today, a society that in which individualism and digital technology has so affected human interaction that participation is uh, almost or like participation in daily life almost is almost non-existent. Right. So art in activism as well as art as activism. And in my experience, as soon as I began undergraduate studies in the late 80s, I was introduced to activism on campus. While at the same time, ironically enough, even on campus, activism and academic activity were spoken of as separate and even incompatible spheres of action, uh, occupying the same space. However, even then, in the late 1980s, art and activism had already presented themselves as mutually supportive, as also often the people were identified as artists are also those who are known as activists, or at least activists and artists mingled in the same social circles in which academics are not most of the time welcome. One artistic activist phenomenon very characteristic of Bandung was, and it still is, jeprut. It's a Sundanese word that means literally snapped, like a broken piece of string, which may be likened to or may be categorized as a kind of happening art or performance art, in which the artist activist performs in public spaces as a form of resistance to authority, and at that time, particularly the Suharto regime and its coercive apparatuses, particularly military. This may be the same trend as the theatrical performances in the streets in Manila, for example, by PETA, as a form of protest in resistance to the authoritarian Marcos regime in the 80s. On this note, James Jasper even notes that artfulness, although he's actually talking about the kind of art as activism or art in activism in the US and Europe, I suppose, artfulness appears in all the dimensions of protest, singly or simultaneously. And furthermore, Dr. Doreen Lee, the other speaker in this section of the conference, also observes that this quote unquote tradition had also continued the artist activist culture following the Reformasi, as she thoroughly studied the street art of the youth of Jakarta, as well as the particular example of the artist who carry out artistic activities and organize performances at the Jatiwangi Art Factory in the district of Majalengka, West Java, which for me is really an offshoot of the artist activist culture in Bandung. While the artist activist community of Bandung created this pastoral sanctuary in Jatiwangi, it also had to address, even after the presumed socio-political reforms of the Reformasi, in the specific cases like that of Babakan Siliwangi, which is the urban green space, as well as a meeting place for artist activists. And they had to address and resist and respond to the increasing efforts of commodifying the landscape of Bandung to serve the commercial goals of Bandung tourism. So in the early 2000s, 2001, 2002, 2003, and 4, there were efforts of transforming this urban green space into a kind of tourist attraction, which many artists activists disapproved of. Another site of contestation between artists and activists and the coalition of state and corporations is the area around the Bandung City Square, or the Alun-Alun Bandung, commonly known as Ex-Palaguna, where there had been a shopping center called Palaguna having been demolished, uh, artists and activists and the community in general thought that the demolition was to make space for a cultural and literacy center in the service of public interest. Uh, Although it turns out that there are also plans of setting up a hotel and a mall there, which invited a lot of resistance and disapproval from the society in general, as well as the artist activist community. Um, while the friction seems to have died out in the case of Babakan Siliwangi, the ex-Palaguna remains a site in which three generations of artist activists continue to perform there as a reminder of the unresolved struggle, and also as a site of where this artist activist presence in Bandung make itself known to the public as well as known to the authorities of the local government. I had been involved in actually in both sites at different times. Two of the most memorable for me would be when the installation of Tisna Sanjaya, at present an artist as well as a professor at the an art professor at the Bandung Technological Institute. Uh, and the installation by Tisna Sanjaya, which symbolized a critique of the military, which had been actually been displayed abroad, was burned down by the authorities in 2004, saying that it looked like trash, which prompted, of course, a protest in the form of a series of performances at the site of the act of state violence. And the other is in a collaborative performance in relation to the ex-Palaguna issue. And at the time, I was involved. I participated as a performer, going through the streets around the city square, and our performance ended because the police at the time was told us to disperse, saying that the performance uh, uh, has the risk of inciting public unrest, although that area is full of street performances. So if there's time in the question and answer, I can go into detail into the details of the event. Um, my point is that the Artist Activist Alliance had existed in Bandung, I think, since the 1970s, as Dr. Doreen Lee also mentions in her work, tracing back to the exponents around the magazine Aktuil, and that this activist artist community has, in fact, I think, become an integral part of the culture of Bandung. Now, my just being in that particular community, although I was not particularly identified as either an artist or an activist, had also taken me to my involvement in the making of a documentary meant to be used as an educational material for labor education. The documentary, entitled Globalization Tapes, was carried out under the direct charge of the Indonesian office of the International Union of Food Workers, or IUF, based in Geneva, and the Indonesian office was based in Bandung. It was then that my academic endeavor in post-colonial studies, in post-colonial theory, found its way, or initial way, into activism. The project was designed so that ultimately the daily workers of the plantations in North Sumatra documented themselves and commented on the social situation and on their place in the global economy, which exploited them, making them have to research the history of global exploitation of workers from colonial times. The project directed by Joshua Oppenheimer and Kristen Seed intervened in the normalcy of the plantation workers as in their daily lives, and in turn, the workers as filmmakers carried out the intervention in public spaces in other parts of North Sumatra, particularly in Medan, the capital of the province. The project also brought Oppenheimer's attention to the particular instances which became the germ of the ideas that he had for his acclaimed works, namely the act of silence and the act of killing and the look of silence. What was for me personally important was that the project showed the possibility of crossovers and the blurring of roles and social identities, not only between artists, activists, and educators, but also making the plantation workers themselves become all three roles performing all three roles at the same time. Plantation workers became not only plantation workers, but also artists, activists, as well as educators for other workers in the sector. My most recent involvement in the merging of art, activism, and academic endeavor was my participation in a number of projects organized by the Bandung Performing Arts Forum, or BPAF for short, which is a group of young artist activists whose aesthetic projects constantly require rigorous research and serious theorizations and involve direct community participation, which both merge the artistic, activist, and academic efforts, and therefore it dismantles the separation between not only the artists and the public, as well as the community members becoming artists, and artists recognize themselves as being involved members of society. And it is in this condition that redefines or that rethinks what acts constitute art, what kind of activities can be categorized as art, what activities are activism, and what activities are academic endeavors. My experiences in being involved in projects which bring theater and performance to address and become part of social issues has also changed my way of viewing my role in higher education and my understanding of what higher education means, and what it means to teach, and redefining what it means to carry out academic endeavors. My colleagues and I, particularly in the Department of Literature and Cultural Studies at Universitas Pajajaran, have not only brought learning and research to the community as stipulated by the authoritative policy on higher learning, the three Dharma, or the three dharmas of higher education, but also we have had the pleasure of bringing the community, artists and activists into the classroom. I myself have on several occasions collaborated with for example, literary activists as well as members of the BPAF in developing the syllabus of and teaching in the course that I teach. What I've learned from art and activism have enabled me to deal with the varied learning aptitudes of my students. It has also made it possible for students to be acquainted with the kind of connective aesthetics, as Susie Gablik proposes, and activism as an integral part of their academic activities. At present, taking advantage of the pandemic, actually, we now at Universitas Padjadjaran have the pleasure of having artists and activists take our courses online together with our registered students. By bringing the long tradition of the Art Activism Alliance in Bandung, we hope that the academic life at our university, at least, can be fueled with the kind of spirit for social change and that we find in the connective aesthetics and activism. And in turn, perhaps academia may return the favor by taking advantage of its institutional nature to help ensure the sustainability of the efforts of art and activism. Thank you.